From the outside, Rachel Morgan's life looked like something out of a magazine spread. A beautifully restored Victorian home nestled in the quiet, tree-lined streets of Asheville, North Carolina. A successful husband, Eric Whitman, with a steady job in real estate development. 2 cars in the driveway, fresh flowers always in the foyer, and Rachel herself, impeccably dressed, soft-spoken, and always smiling at neighborhood events. But behind the floral curtains and perfectly pruned hedges was a very different truth. Rachel, 38, hadn't felt like herself in years. Every smile was rehearsed, every step measured, every word filtered through a silent, invisible screen of fear. She had once been full of energy and ideas, teaching art at a local elementary school, painting late into the night, laughing with friends at potluck dinners. But all that had gradually faded after she married Eric, a man whose charm in public masked a cold, calculating cruelty in private. The change hadn't been instant. At first it was subtle. Eric would correct her in front of guests. "Don't talk about that, Rachel, it's not interesting." He'd mock her outfits, ask if she was really going out looking like that. He started controlling the finances, telling her what she could spend, where she could shop. Then came the rules. No visiting her mother without asking him first, no locking the bathroom door, no phone calls after 8 p.m., because he didn't like surprises. Rachel told herself he was just stressed, that maybe she talked too much, that it was her job to keep the peace. But peace was never really the goal for Eric. Control was. By the 3rd year of their marriage, Rachel had quietly stopped teaching. She told her colleagues she wanted a break, but the truth was that Eric had made her feel like she was wasting her time. "You're not really contributing to this household," he once said as he tossed one of her paintings in the garage. "Art doesn't pay the bills." Her world became smaller with every passing month. Friends drifted away after she canceled too many lunches or didn't answer calls. Her mother, Linda Morgan, tried to stay close, but Rachel always had an excuse. "I'm just tired," she would say. "Eric's been working late." What she didn't say was that Eric had started questioning every conversation she had with Linda, even reading her texts and accusing her of gossiping behind his back. And the worst part? He never hit her. Not once. That made everything harder to explain, to herself, and certainly to others. There were no bruises to point to, no broken bones, no hospital visits. Just the constant erosion of her confidence, the weight of walking on eggshells, the way she flinched when he raised his voice, even when it was at the dog. One evening, Rachel spent over 2 hours preparing Eric's favorite meal: rosemary chicken, garlic mashed potatoes, and glazed carrots. She lit candles, folded the napkins the way he liked, even chilled his preferred brand of soda. When he walked in and saw the table, he paused, looked around, and then said flatly, "The carrots are overcooked." Rachel smiled, apologized, and promised to do better next time. Then she sat in silence as he ate most of the food she'd made, criticized a coworker she'd never met, and turned up the TV while she cleaned up alone. Later that night, she stood in the darkened kitchen, staring at the sink full of soapy water, her hands trembling just above the surface. She didn't cry. She hadn't in a long time. Tears, like laughter, had become foreign things. Somewhere inside her, something had gone numb. And in that numbness, a question quietly formed. Is this all there is for me? Rachel didn't know it yet, but that small question would be the beginning of something much bigger. A crack in the carefully painted image, a shift in the silence. And far across town, her mother Linda had started to notice. She wasn't sure exactly what was wrong, but she knew her daughter's voice sounded more distant with every call. Something was off, and she was no longer willing to accept polite excuses. Linda Morgan had always prided herself on knowing her daughter. Even when Rachel was little, she could tell when something was off, whether it was a scraped knee she was hiding or a hurt feeling she tried to bury behind a polite smile. Now, at 63, retired from her job as a high school guidance counselor, Linda found herself staring at her phone after every call from Rachel, unsettled in a way she couldn't quite explain. It wasn't what Rachel said. It was what she didn't. The conversations had become shorter, more scripted, Rachel's voice lacked its usual warmth, like she was speaking through a filter. She rarely offered details. There were no funny stories from her day, no mentions of painting, or the books she used to devour in a weekend. When Linda asked if she'd come over for Sunday lunch, Rachel always hesitated, giving vague reasons about errands or Eric's schedule. And Eric, Linda never liked that man, too polished, too performative. He'd shake your hand like he was running for office, then look past you when you spoke. Even early in their marriage, she sensed he had a way of making Rachel shrink. Just a little at first, then more and more. One Sunday afternoon, Linda decided to drop by Rachel's house unannounced, under the pretense of returning a casserole dish. It was nearly 3 p.m., and the front yard was still, no music, no laughter. Rachel opened the door with a faint smile, but her eyes gave her away, dull, hollow, and rimmed with fatigue. She looked thinner, too, and her sleeves were pushed down despite the warm spring weather. "Mom," Rachel said, clearly caught off guard. "You should have called." "I figured you might be busy, but I just needed to stretch my legs," Linda replied lightly. She stepped into the foyer, noting how pristine everything looked. Too pristine. Like a showroom. No sign of personal touches, no signs of life. They sat in the kitchen for tea, and Linda gently probed, asking about her art, her friends, her health. Rachel responded in soft generalities, offering nothing specific, her gaze frequently darting toward the clock. Then there was a noise from upstairs. Heavy footsteps. Rachel flinched. That one moment told Linda more than words ever could. Eric came down a minute later, his presence filling the room like a storm cloud. He greeted Linda with a cold smile, thanked her for the casserole dish, and asked, just a little too politely, how long she planned to stay. Rachel's shoulders stiffened as she stared into her tea. After Linda left, her heart pounded the entire drive home. She didn't have physical proof, but her instincts screamed that something was deeply wrong. That night, she pulled out a spiral notebook and began writing everything she remembered from the visit. Dates, behaviors, phrases. She began researching domestic abuse, not just the kind with bruises, but the psychological, emotional kind. And what she found made her blood run cold. Rachel's situation checked every box. Isolation from family and friends, loss of independence, constant self-blame, fear without violence, the slow erasure of identity. Linda had always respected boundaries, but this wasn't about privacy anymore. This was about safety. Her daughter was slipping away right in front of her, and she was done pretending not to see it. The next week, Linda called Rachel and invited her out for coffee, alone. Rachel declined. She tried again the week after. Again, Rachel hesitated, citing Eric's busy schedule, so Linda changed tactics. She visited Safe Haven Outreach Center, a local nonprofit that helped women in abusive relationships. She didn't bring Rachel. She went alone. She wanted to learn how to help, what to say, what not to say. She met with a counselor named Carla Jennings, who listened to her concerns, validated her instincts, and helped her understand that pushing too hard could backfire, but doing nothing was worse. Linda began writing Rachel letters, short, gentle ones, just reminders of who she was, of how strong she used to be, of how much she was loved. She left them in Rachel's mailbox when Eric wasn't home. Inside one letter, she tucked a card from Safe Haven with Carla's direct number. She also started keeping track of Eric's behavior publicly, logging comments he made at family gatherings, the way he interrupted Rachel, the moment she stayed silent when once she would have spoken up. Linda wasn't looking for a fight. She was preparing for a rescue. Then came the night Rachel called her at nearly 11:30 p.m., a trembling, breathless whisper. "Mom, I need to talk to you. I can't do this anymore." Linda didn't hesitate. She was already slipping on her coat. She didn't know exactly what she'd find when she got there, but she knew this. Whatever happened next, she wouldn't let her daughter go through it alone. Linda's car rolled to a stop in front of Rachel's house just before midnight. The porch light was off, the street eerily quiet. She waited in the dark, hands gripping the steering wheel, stomach churning with fear and fury. Then the front door opened slowly, and Rachel stepped outside. No suitcase, just a canvas tote slung over her shoulder, and Milo, her old golden retriever, on a leash. She looked pale, drained, but determined. Without a word, Rachel climbed into the passenger seat. Linda reached over, squeezed her hand, and drove. They didn't speak much during the 30-minute drive back to Linda's place. Rachel sat hunched, staring out the window like someone watching the pieces of her life disappear in the rearview mirror. When they arrived, Linda guided her inside, made tea, and wrapped her in a blanket. For a while, they just sat there in silence, letting the weight of years settle between them. Finally, Rachel spoke. "It's not just the way he talks to me or how he controls everything. He's unpredictable now. He followed me into the bathroom last night because I took too long brushing my teeth, said I must be getting ready for someone else." I laughed, nervously, and he grabbed my arm so tight I still have a mark. It was the look in his eyes, Mom. It was like he could really hurt me and not feel bad about it. Linda felt her throat tighten, but she didn't cry. Not now. This wasn't the time for tears. This was the time for action. The next morning, they met with Carla Jennings, the counselor Linda had contacted at Safe Haven Outreach Center. Carla greeted Rachel with warmth but without pity. She asked careful, gentle questions. She didn't push. She just listened, and Rachel talked. For the first time in years, she talked freely. She spoke about the gaslighting, the constant surveillance, the financial manipulation, how she couldn't go for a walk without being questioned, how she hadn't bought new clothes in 2 years without asking Eric first, how she had to leave her phone on the kitchen counter at night in case he needed to check something. Carla nodded as she took notes. "Rachel, what you're describing is coercive control. It's abuse. Just because he hasn't hit you doesn't mean you haven't been harmed." Hearing the word abuse made Rachel flinch at first, but it also made something click. It wasn't her fault. She hadn't imagined it, and she wasn't alone. With Carla's help, they began building a safety plan. Rachel would stay with Linda for the time being. Linda changed her Wi-Fi password, installed new locks, and notified a few trusted neighbors to keep an eye out. Rachel also deactivated her social media accounts and opened a new email address. They contacted a legal aid attorney who specialized in domestic abuse cases and began documenting everything: messages, voicemails, photos of bruises, notes from Rachel's journal. Eric's reaction was swift and ugly. He called non-stop for the first 3 days, alternating between threats and pleading. When Rachel didn't answer, he showed up at Linda's front door. Thankfully, Linda didn't answer either. She simply called the police and recorded the entire encounter through the peephole. When officers arrived, Eric claimed he was just checking on his wife, but his voice trembled with rage. The police warned him not to return. Linda filed for a temporary restraining order the next morning. That only escalated things. Eric's attorney sent a letter demanding Rachel return marital property and accusing her of abandonment. He denied any abuse and threatened to sue for defamation. But Rachel's legal team stood firm. They filed for legal separation, citing emotional and psychological abuse, and requested a formal investigation. They also petitioned the court for an emergency protective order and began preparing for a full evidentiary hearing. Rachel had expected this to be the hardest part, standing in court, speaking aloud the things she'd buried for so long, but something shifted in her. With every step, she regained a little more of her voice. It was terrifying, but it was also empowering. During one hearing, Eric sat across from her in his tailored suit, smirking, confident that charm and denial would win the day. But when Rachel took the stand and calmly, clearly laid out years of control, manipulation, and fear, something broke in that courtroom. Even the judge's demeanor changed. She read aloud an excerpt from a journal Rachel had kept in secret. "I used to think silence kept me safe, but it only made me disappear." The courtroom fell silent. By the end of the hearing, the judge granted the protective order, allowed Rachel temporary possession of her personal belongings, and referred the case to family court for further proceedings. Outside the courthouse, Rachel exhaled like she hadn't in years. She still had a long way to go: divorce proceedings, financial disentanglement, and emotional recovery. But she wasn't walking that road alone anymore, and more importantly, she wasn't walking in fear. The day after the court hearing, Rachel stood in Linda's backyard barefoot, toes curled into the grass, sunlight warming her face. It had been years since she'd stood outside without a watchful eye tracking her every movement. Just the act of being alone with her thoughts, unobserved, felt almost foreign, like slipping into a forgotten language. Freedom, she was learning, was quiet. It didn't shout or arrive all at once. It crept in softly, through open windows, through shared laughter, over coffee, through the absence of fear. But healing? Healing was loud. Healing clawed its way out of her chest at night in the form of panic attacks, memories she couldn't stop, and waves of self-doubt that made her question everything, especially herself. "I should have left sooner," she whispered one night at the kitchen table, her fingers wrapped around a mug of chamomile tea. Linda reached across and placed her hand over Rachel's. "You left when you were ready. That's what matters." Some days Rachel believed her. Other days, the guilt was overwhelming. Guilt for staying, guilt for losing herself, guilt for not noticing the signs earlier. She'd wake up drenched in sweat, certain she heard Eric's voice somewhere outside, only to realize it was just the wind or the TV in the next room. Carla, her counselor at Safe Haven, helped her navigate these emotional landmines. They met twice a week, and in those sessions Rachel began to unpack not just what Eric had done to her, but how deeply she had internalized it. "He didn't just control your behavior," Carla said. "He trained your mind to believe you deserved it." That truth hit harder than any insult Eric had ever thrown her way. Carla encouraged Rachel to start journaling again, this time not in secret. She gave her exercises in self-trust, helped her name her triggers, and talked her through moments when Rachel second-guessed whether any of it had even really happened. "Gaslighting isn't just something abusers do," Carla explained. "It's something survivors keep doing to themselves, even long after the abuse is over." In time, Rachel started taking small steps outward. She reactivated her old email account, not the one Eric had monitored, but her personal one from years ago. She wrote to a friend she hadn't spoken to since her wedding, unsure if the message would even be read. To her surprise, the friend responded within hours, saying she had always suspected something was wrong, but didn't know how to reach out. That exchange opened a door. Soon, Rachel was reconnecting with more people from her past, former colleagues, college friends, even her old art mentor, a woman named Janine who invited her to come by the local community center to see their new painting studio. Walking into that studio for the first time in nearly 6 years brought tears to Rachel's eyes. The smell of turpentine, the blank canvases, the soft hum of jazz in the background. It was like visiting an old part of herself that had been boarded up and forgotten. She hesitated at first. Her hands trembled the first time she picked up a brush. But then, slowly, the strokes came back. Not perfect, not confident, but honest. She painted for hours that day, barely noticing the time pass. That night, she returned home with paint under her nails and color in her cheeks. Linda noticed it right away. "You look like Rachel again," she said softly. Rachel smiled. "I feel like I found her, buried under years of silence, but she's still here." One afternoon, about 3 weeks later, Rachel stood in front of the mirror in Linda's guest room. She was wearing a deep green blouse, a color Eric had always told her clashed with her eyes. But now, under the soft light, it made her feel alive. She brushed her hair, applied a touch of mascara, and looked at her reflection, not to please anyone, but to reclaim it. That evening, she attended a survivor support group at Safe Haven. She didn't plan to speak, just to listen. But as others shared their stories, raw, painful, and painfully familiar, Rachel felt something stir inside her. When her turn came, she stood up slowly. "My name is Rachel," she said, her voice shaking. "And I forgot how to see myself without someone else's permission, but I'm learning again. And tonight feels like the first time in a long time that I know I'm still here." The room was silent for a moment, then filled with soft applause and knowing nods. Healing, she realized, wasn't about erasing what had happened. It was about reclaiming what remained and choosing every single day to build something new with it. By the time the formal divorce hearings began, Rachel no longer trembled at the mention of Eric's name. The anxiety still came in waves, sure, but she was no longer drowning in it. With Carla's support, her mother's unwavering presence, and the small army of documentation they had gathered, Rachel walked into that courthouse not as a broken woman, but as someone finally standing in the light after years in the shadows. Eric, on the other hand, entered the courtroom with the same smug confidence he'd always worn: tailored navy suit, polished shoes, that signature smirk that had once made Rachel second-guess her own reality. He had hired an aggressive attorney who painted Rachel as emotionally unstable and vindictive, claiming she left the marriage on a whim, influenced by outside voices with ulterior motives. He even submitted an affidavit stating that Rachel had deliberately neglected her marital duties and contributed to emotional instability within the household. But Rachel's legal team was ready. They presented a timeline of emotional abuse, complete with voice recordings, written messages, Rachel's private journal entries, photographs of bruises on her upper arm and wrist, and a letter from Carla, who testified to the psychological impact of coercive control. Carla explained to the court the nature of invisible abuse, how manipulation, surveillance, and isolation could destroy a person from the inside out without ever leaving a scar. Rachel's voice didn't waver when she took the stand. "He never hit me," she told the court, "but he erased me. Slowly, quietly. He made me question every instinct I had until I believed I didn't deserve to exist outside his rules." She described the night he blocked her in the bathroom for 20 minutes because she wouldn't hand over her phone, how he threatened to cancel her health insurance if she didn't apologize for embarrassing him at a dinner party, and how he once called her mother a parasite for suggesting Rachel go back to work. The judge listened carefully, interrupting Eric's attorney twice when he attempted to dismiss Rachel's experiences as emotional exaggeration. In a pivotal moment during the hearing, Linda was called as a witness. Calm and composed, she recounted the changes she'd witnessed in her daughter over the years: the shift in posture, the withdrawn conversations, the fear that became routine. "I raised a vibrant, joyful, creative woman," Linda said, "and I watched that light get dimmed over time, not by chance, but by design. I will not apologize for stepping in. I only wish I had sooner." The judge nodded slowly, scribbling a note. Eric attempted to take the stand himself, hoping to charm the court as he had charmed so many others, but this time his facade cracked. When questioned about controlling Rachel's finances, he dismissed it as financial responsibility. When asked about why Rachel hadn't worked in years, he scoffed and said, "She didn't have the mental capacity for the pressure of real employment." When pressed further, his temper surfaced. He raised his voice, blamed Linda for poisoning Rachel, and mocked the idea of therapy as emotional hand-holding for weak people. That was his mistake. The judge's tone changed immediately. What had been a battle of narratives suddenly became clear. One party was calm, consistent, and seeking freedom. The other was defensive, demeaning, and clearly disturbed by the loss of control. By the final day of the proceedings, the courtroom atmosphere had shifted entirely. The judge ruled in Rachel's favor on every major point. She would retain all personal property and assets under her name. Eric was ordered to pay spousal support for the next 24 months due to the financial hardship caused by prolonged isolation from employment. The protective order was extended indefinitely, with a clear warning that any violation would result in immediate jail time. And most importantly, the judge recognized the presence of emotional abuse and coercive control in the marriage, a formal acknowledgement that would remain in court records. When the gavel struck, Rachel exhaled. It wasn't just about the judgment. It was the validation, the public recognition that her suffering had been real, that it mattered, that she mattered. Eric didn't look at her as he left the courtroom. He brushed past her without a word, his expression stiff, the smirk finally gone. Outside, the late autumn sun warmed Rachel's face. She stood on the courthouse steps, flanked by Linda and Carla, her shoulders square and her spine tall. Her hands were shaking, but not from fear, from relief. "Are you okay?" Linda asked. Rachel nodded, eyes fixed on the horizon. "I think I'm starting to be." 6 months after the final court ruling, Rachel stood before a blank canvas in the downtown Asheville Community Art Center. A quiet jazz melody played from a speaker nearby, mixing with the occasional sound of brushes tapping glass jars and the gentle hum of creativity. This was her sanctuary now, not just a place to paint, but a place to breathe. She no longer lived with Linda. In February, she'd moved into a small 2-bedroom apartment not far from the Riverwalk, with large windows and creaky wooden floors. It wasn't much, but it was hers. She'd filled it with color: sunflower yellow pillows, forest green curtains, thrifted art prints, and one of her own early paintings hung above the couch. Milo, her golden retriever, had found his favorite spot by the window, where he could watch birds and nap in the sun. Rachel had started teaching again, part-time art classes for women at the Outreach Center, many of whom were also survivors. She didn't talk about her own story unless they asked, and when they did, she didn't speak from a place of pain, but from purpose. "I don't teach you to paint so you can make something pretty," she told them one afternoon. "I teach you so you can find your voice again, even if it's just in color." Her journey wasn't over. Healing, she'd learned, was not a destination. It was a daily choice. There were still nights she jolted awake, her heart racing from dreams that felt too real. There were still unexpected moments when fear snuck up behind her, when a raised voice in a grocery store made her flinch, or when a man stood too close in line and her breath caught in her throat. But those moments didn't define her anymore. What defined her now was what she chose after. She chose to stay, to breathe, to speak, to live. Linda visited often, though she no longer hovered. She had returned to her quilting circle, picked up gardening again, and even started dating a kind man from her church, a retired mail carrier named Henry who brought her coffee every Sunday. One afternoon, Linda stopped by the center to drop off fresh-baked muffins. She stood at the doorway watching Rachel teach. Her sleeves rolled up, a streak of cobalt blue on her cheek, her laugh echoing warmly through the room. "She's back," Linda whispered to Carla, who was now one of Rachel's closest friends. "But she's not just back. She's stronger than I've ever seen her." Later that week, the center director approached Rachel with a proposal. They wanted to launch a new art therapy initiative for women transitioning out of domestic violence shelters, and they wanted Rachel to lead it, not just as an instructor, but as the face of the program. At first, Rachel hesitated. The idea of being public again brought a familiar twinge of fear. But then she thought of all the women she'd met, the ones still too afraid to leave, the ones who needed to know they weren't alone. She accepted. The program launched in May under the name Canvas and Courage. At the opening, Rachel gave a brief speech, just a few words, but they carried weight. "I used to think my story ended in silence," she said. "But I've learned that silence isn't the end, it's the space before your voice returns. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is speak, even if it's just through a brushstroke." The applause was quiet but heartfelt. She didn't need standing ovations. She had something better: peace. As summer rolled in, Rachel's life unfolded gently, one day at a time. She spent weekends walking by the river with Milo, evenings reading on the balcony with the wind in her hair. She painted not for escape anymore, but for joy. She reconnected with old friends, hosted small dinners, and even traveled to Charleston for an art retreat, her first solo trip in years. One evening, she stood outside on her balcony as the sun dipped low behind the Blue Ridge Mountains. The sky was streaked with gold and pink, and the breeze carried the smell of honeysuckle. She closed her eyes and smiled, not the smile she used to force, but one born from deep within. She had survived, she had rebuilt, and now she was free. Rachel Morgan's journey is more than a story of escaping an abusive marriage. It's a powerful reminder that not all wounds are visible, but all deserve to be acknowledged. Emotional abuse, coercive control, and psychological manipulation often go unnoticed because they don't leave bruises, but they erode a person's sense of self, dignity, and safety just as painfully, sometimes even more so. One of the most important takeaways is this: you don't need to have physical scars to say, enough. You don't have to justify your pain to anyone to begin healing. Just like Rachel, many people stay silent for too long, paralyzed by shame, fear of judgment, or the belief that what they're going through isn't serious enough. But the truth is, if your spirit is being crushed, your story matters. You matter. Rachel's healing began not in a courtroom, but in small, quiet acts of reclaiming herself, picking up a paintbrush, saying no without apology, laughing without permission. These moments remind us that healing is not a straight line. It's a process, a rebuilding of trust with yourself, one moment at a time. And then there's Linda, Rachel's mother, proof that love doesn't wait for the perfect words. It listens, it watches, it refuses to look away. Sometimes, being a lifeline means showing up even when you don't know what to say, even when the person you love can't ask for help out loud. Her unwavering support teaches us that we don't need to be experts to make a difference. We just need to stay. In life, we may find ourselves in Rachel's shoes, needing to rediscover our worth, or in Linda's, being called to notice the quiet cries of someone we love. In both roles, we hold the power to change a life. Because healing begins the moment someone feels seen, heard, and believed.